In the summer of 2008, construction workers renovating Langberg Castle in the Austrian Alps broke through a wall, uncovering a sealed vault that had been hidden for half a millennium. Inside, they found a time capsule of 15th century life: leather shoes, handmade playing cards, hundreds of coins, and pieces of pottery packed between the floorboards as insulation. But buried among the debris were 4 pieces of linen that made archaeologists do a double take. The linen fragments featured distinct, separately cut cups sewn together vertically, shoulder straps, and eyelets for lacing. They were structurally identical to a modern bra. For decades, historians assumed the modern bra was an invention of the late 19th or early 20th century. The accepted narrative dictated that before then, European women either went entirely without support or spent hundreds of years strapped into rigid corsets. When fiber samples were sent to the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, carbon dating confirmed the linen was from the 1400s. Someone sat down 500 years ago and crafted a piece of underwear that a modern lingerie brand would instantly recognize. The design was functional, refined, and surprisingly modern. Yet for the next 400 years, this technology effectively vanished from the Western world, replaced by a rigid obsession that traded physical support for social control. Long before the Middle Ages, humans across multiple continents independently realized that bodies in motion benefit from some kind of management. Practical breast support was a basic ancient instinct. On the island of Crete around 1600 BCE, Minoan women wore tight-fitting garments that deliberately lifted and framed the breasts, leaving them completely exposed. This was everyday outerwear, treating the chest as a prominent symbol of fertility and social status. 1,000 years later, Romans prioritized physical containment. In a massive Sicilian estate, a mosaic depicts elite female athletes competing in 2-piece, bikini-style garments. The visible stitching and structure show these aren't single strips of cloth, but garments explicitly engineered for high-impact movement. This focus on utility disappeared completely in the mid-1500s, when Catherine de' Medici arrived in France. She brought a fashion trend from Italy known as the body, the earliest version of the corset. Catherine's version was stiffened with layered fabric and reinforced with a busk, a long, flat piece of whalebone or wood inserted directly down the front of the garment. The physical mechanics eliminated any natural curve at the waist and violently pushed the bust upward into a rigid shelf. Medici's standard abandoned the engineering of movement. For the next 4 centuries, the goal of clothing was no longer to accommodate the body, but to force the human anatomy into a rigid, artificial mold. By the Victorian era, the pursuit of the hourglass ideal reached its extreme. Women laced themselves down to a 13-inch waist, roughly the circumference of a large cantaloupe. The sustained compression physically displaced internal organs and caused a condition doctors documented as corset liver, where the lower ribs pressed deep grooves directly into the organ. The physical toll was enforced by a strict sociological trap. Society equated a tightly laced waist directly with strict discipline and high character, while an unlaced torso implied a loose moral compass. By the 1870s, women within the dress reform movement began organizing lectures and publishing pamphlets against these constraints. Novelists and activists urged women to throw their cruel steel and whalebone cages into a bonfire and never look back. The most effective attack on the corset came from Hermine Cadal, a radical activist who fought on the barricades of the 1871 Paris Commune, escaping deportation before returning to France to open a lingerie shop. At the 1889 Universal Exposition in Paris, Cadal presented a brilliant structural solution. She took a traditional corset and literally cut it in half. The bottom remained a rigid waist cincher, but the top portion supported the breasts using 2 distinct cups and shoulder straps instead of pushing them up from below. Across the Atlantic in 1910, a 19-year-old New York socialite named Mary Phelps Jacob tackled the problem from a different angle. Preparing for a ball, she realized her whalebone corset poked visibly through her sheer evening gown. Using 2 silk handkerchiefs and some pink ribbon, she stitched together a lightweight backless garment that naturally separated her chest and remained entirely invisible. But the corset industry had amassed immense commercial power and heavy moral weight. A few clever design innovations couldn't break the cycle. It would require a massive global catastrophe to finally strip the steel from women's torsos. In 1917, the United States War Industries Board sent out an urgent request for American women to stop buying corsets. The military needed the metal. By removing steel boning from civilian clothing, women freed up an estimated 28,000 tons of material, enough to build 2 full battleships. At the same time, the war effort pulled women onto factory floors and into heavy industrial labor by the millions. Operating heavy industrial machinery while trapped inside a rigid cage of whalebone and steel was a deadly liability. Women required practical undergarments that actually allowed them to breathe and move. The modern garment was fully realized in the 1920s by a Russian immigrant named Ida Rosenthal. She recognized a massive flaw in early bra designs. Bodies are completely different shapes. By grouping women by bust measurements, she introduced the concept of standardized cup sizing, laying the groundwork for the A through D system still used worldwide today. By the 1960s, the cultural pendulum swung again. The bra transitioned from a garment of practical wartime liberation into a political symbol. Feminists argued that restrictive undergarments were tools used to impose male expectations on women's bodies, throwing them into freedom trash cans at public protests. This 500-year gap maps the shifting ownership of the female form. The design of underwear serves as a physical record of who, in any given era, held the authority to dictate a woman's shape. Which brings us back to the 3,500-year-old Minoan snake goddess. She stands out exactly because her exposed, framing bodice completely ignores the centuries of rigid control and constant shifting standards that followed her. The standards governing the female form are local and temporary. They are defined, discarded, and recreated by the specific anxieties of each new generation, which inevitably assumes its own approach is the final word.